So now let's go ahead and jump into my first step of mix bus processing, and that is adding color and distortion to our entire mix bus. This is where we can add distortion or harmonic processing to give the entire mix a little bit of a singular color. So we'll take a look at tape machine plugins, console emulations, and harmonic exciters in this video. So first, let's go ahead and jump into tape plugins. So the interesting thing is whenever we're using something like tape, it's going to shift the balance of our track. So after we add in this plugin, we can go back and adjust things in the mix to sort of optimize them for the tape machine emulation. Especially things like sub bass tend to shift quite a lot in volume once you run them into a tape plugin. So it's really nice to be able to go back and adjust individual elements within the mix in order to kind of optimize everything for our tape. And that's what makes this process different than mastering, is we're actively going back and still mixing the record and changing individual tracks as we're going in and processing our mix bus. So let's go ahead and jump into this mix. This is my track from Producing House with Native Instruments course that's up on Groove 3. So feel free to check out the series if you want to know how I wrote this song here. We'll just be using this as an example. And I'll actually just include a bounce of this entire track as well, just like a 2-channel master recording, so that way you can process this if you'd like, just to mess around with it. But what we'll do now is go ahead and apply some tape. So the first thing we need to decide for this is what type of tape plugin we want to use. So I really like the UAD Studer A800 tape machine. The Softtube tape machine is also quite good as well. Or you could go with something really weird like a cassette tape plugin for an ultra lo-fi character on your entire mix. So this can be really great depending on what style and what sound you're going for. So for example, if you're working on like an indie bedroom pop record with a lot of acoustic guitars and super dreamy vocals, something like a really lo-fi tape plugin with a cassette tape could actually sound really cool on your entire mix bus, just to impart this really interesting color to everything. But in this example, we kind of have a house track. So let me go and just play you kind of the main drop section. So with this, we don't want an ultra lo-fi tape. We want something that has kind of a nice 90s house quality to it, and almost a little bit like a vintage disco flavor, but not something that's ultra lo-fi. So I'm going to go with the Studer A800. And that brings me to one of the first things about applying mix bus effects, is you want to have a specific goal in mind whenever you're going through and applying effects. So you want to have an idea of where you want to take things before you just start randomly adding in plugins, because this is more of a subtle process in your mix. It's not as drastic as adding like a really heavy distortion to a guitar. So you want to make sure that you have a goal before you start adding things, because you don't want to mess up your mix. All right, so let's go ahead and grab the UAD tape plugin. I'll go to my plugins, and I'm using the UAD Spark plugins, which can run natively inside of Ableton, which is super nice. And we will go ahead and grab the Studer A800. I'm just going to go ahead and drop this down onto my master channel. Alternatively, you could also go through and basically apply everything in a singular group right before it hits your master channel as well. But just to keep things simple, we'll just apply this all to the master chain. So just running this through on its default settings, let's take a listen to what this sounds like, and then I'll just bypass it just to show you before and after. So we're definitely driving this too hard, but you can hear especially that sub bass, it becomes a lot more rounded, and it also boosts in volume. So again, like I was mentioning a little bit earlier, the level of our bass is going to change once we start using something like a tape. So we can definitely hear too much distortion. So let's go ahead and turn that down just a little bit. This is my input gain, so that way it's not driving the tape as hard. We'll just go ahead and leave this on the 15 IPS, which is the inches per second on the tape machine. There's various different settings here. Basically, you're going to get a higher quality tape sound on 30 than you will on 7.5. But because I'm using a tape plugin here, I want it to actually sound like it's a tape machine. So we'll just leave that on the 15 IPS. So that way we get a little bit of that tape flavor. Because that's the whole point of putting this on the mix bus, is I want the record to sound like it was running into a tape machine. And then we need to go through and select the style of tape. So most tape emulation plugins have different types of tape formulas that you can run everything into. Usually some are more old school sounding, a little bit more vintage. And then there's newer tape formulas that are a little bit more even and balanced. So in the case of this UAD one, 250 is going to be the most vintage one, and then the GP9 is going to be the most high quality one. So you can hear how the high frequencies change and then also the low frequencies change as we're scrolling through those different tapes. In the case of this example, I want to go ahead and use GP9. I find that this sounds the most balanced on master channels and also on drums or elements with a lot of sub bass. So that's what we'll be using here, but feel free to go and adjust that accordingly. Let's also boost the master output volume just a little bit so that way we have everything basically level matched. So we're getting a lot of glue and cohesion from this tape machine, but right now that bass is definitely too loud, so let's go ahead and adjust that. Because we're still mixing, we can go back and play with levels. So this just gives my mix a lot more of a cohesive tone, and it also is enhancing that bass in a way that where it sounds like it's actually running through a tape machine, so it kind of rounds it out and adds some subtle harmonics to it. That sounded quite interesting. So that's the first example of mix bus processing, is you can use tape machine emulations to add cohesion and saturation to everything to give it a little bit of that vintage flavor. And again, this works on any style of tape machine and also any style of recording as well. I do recommend using the highest quality available plugins or external hardware whenever you're working with your mix bus, because you are using this kind of more of a subtle way. It's helpful to have the highest quality processing available. So let's go ahead and take this off, and now let's go ahead and play around with some console emulations, which is my second way that I like to add a little bit of color, harmonics, and distortion to my records. For this, I would use the highest quality plugins again, so like UAD and Brainworks tend to have the best console emulations. Slate Digital also has some really great ones as well. So it just depends on what you have available. But for this, we're going to go ahead and use one of their AMIC consoles from Brainworks. So that is going to be the AMIC 9099, which was an offshoot of Neve. Rupert Neve went and made AMIC for a while after he made Neve, and then moved on to Rupert Neve Designs. So this console kind of has almost like a 90s Neve tone to it. So especially in house records, this can sound super cool. Interesting thing about this plugin is it's actually emulating the different channels that happen on a hardware mixer. So you've got left and right channels, which are individual and slightly different from one another. Then you can have distortion and then all the different sections inside of a console. So because we're just using this for color, let's go ahead and turn off the compressor, the limiter, and the gate. We don't want those running because we're just trying to use this for color. I want to run it through the EQ circuit here because I want the color of just running it through the EQ. A lot of hardware mixing consoles, whenever you run something through an EQ circuit, even if everything's defaulted to 0, it still imparts a little bit of color to everything. So we want to keep that. And same with low pass and high pass filters as well. The other thing we're going to do with the Brainworks one is I'm going to take the virtual gain all the way down, so that way I don't have any noise. It's not going to affect the gain staging of my unit, it's just going to affect the noise level. If I turn that up, you can kind of hear a little bit of that hiss. We don't want that because we're working in digital. We don't want additional hiss, so I'm just going to turn that all the way down. But that'll just depend on the style of plugin you have. But usually on the Brainworks console emulations, they have this virtual gain, so you just want to take that all the way down to off so you don't have any noise. And then let's go ahead and just run it through on its default setting and see how this shifts our mix. So you get a little bit more forward mids, you get a little bit more softened highs, and then that bass really sounds quite different than the tape. So we're starting to get a little bit more distortion and cohesion on the entire mix because we're running it through this vintage styled console. Now the other important thing on here is we have the ability to adjust the amount of distortion. So sometimes this would be done through just driving the input of the console, but in this case it's done through this THD, which is the total harmonic distortion knob. And that lets me just go through and dial in the amount of distortion. So let's go ahead and play around with that. I'm going to go ahead and drive it a little bit too hard, see what kind of distortion it gives me, and then we'll back it off and dial it in for a mix. And then we can go through and play around with any levels on individual tracks that we need to. So you can hear that's a lot of distortion. Don't want quite that much. That clap kind of jumps out. Let's maybe take that clap down a little bit. Without it. So it just gives my entire mix a lot more cohesive tone, and we can add a little bit of that distortion and harmonics to everything as well. So that's the other way that I like to add color to my mix buses, is to use console emulations and to use those to kind of impart a little bit of like a vintage tonal characteristic to everything. Now the last method of color I want to talk about is going to be harmonic exciters. You can think about these as like a multi-band distortion, but they're specifically designed to be a lot more subtle. than most styles of distortions. So they're about adding very subtle harmonics to the sound without drastically changing the character of a mix. Harmonic exciters are commonly used during mastering because they are a lot more subtle. And in this case, we'll use it to color our mix bus to see how it can elevate the sound of our mix. So I'm going to go ahead in my plugins and I'm going to use the Ozone 9 exciter. So let's just type in exciter. Let's go to Ozone and I'll just go ahead and drag this down to my mix bus. There's a bunch of different harmonic exciters available. Some are designed more for mixing, some are designed for mastering. Again, I would recommend choosing the highest quality plugin available, like a master grade one. The Ozone stuff is really fantastic, especially even on a mix bus. So that's what we'll be using here. So the first thing that we need to do is go ahead and set up the harmonic exciter. It's got 4 bands available. So 4 multi-bands. Let's go ahead and just create our 4 bands. And then I'll just play that main drop section, hit learn, and just let it automatically decide where it's going to put these different bands. That's the nice thing about the Ozone stuff is it's super advanced and really good at sort of interpolating how your mix is going to sound. So it basically is really great at just setting these bands automatically. There we go. Okay, so that has went ahead and set all these different sections in my mix. Let's start off on the highs. So I'll solo out the highs. And then we could basically increase the amount of distortion. So you can see it's pushing those mid-range forward quite a bit. And then on this drop down, we have all these different styles of distortions. We have tube distortion, triodes, one specifically designed for more retro style, or even things that sort of emulate that analog harmonics that you get from mixing consoles. The analog mode is actually one of my favorite modes on this. It's actually kind of similar to the plugin we just used, the console emulation of the AMIC console from Brainworks. But this one will basically just add that little bit of extra flavor on top. And especially because we want this to be more subtle, we're not trying to radically change our mix here. Let's go ahead and use the analog mode on all of these. But feel free to play around with these different modes depending on the type of styling you'd like to impart onto your mix. So let's dial this in. So just a little bit of extra stuff on top. Let's not go too wild with it because again, we're not trying to radically change our mix. Let's just play around with those amounts. So you can hear there, especially in that kick, you get a little bit of that folding back in on itself with that distortion. Maybe add like 4. Hop over to this one. Let's do 4 as well. And then on the lows, I don't want to distort them too much because you can hear how it starts to kind of clip almost. I don't want to have that. So we'll just leave that on 0. And then let's listen to it all together and play around with it. So the effect is really subtle, but it just adds this little bit of air and lift to the entire mix. I'll flip through them a couple different times. Make sure you're either on a nice set of studio headphones or a nice set of studio speakers, so that way you can hear those individual changes. So it just opens up that mix. It allows it to breathe a little bit more, and we get kind of this additional detail inside of that mix. And that's what's interesting about harmonic exciters is whenever they're used properly, they just sort of enhance the mix and almost help it feel a little bit more three-dimensional. Especially those reverbs are a lot easier to hear. The cool thing is too, is you can actually link the bands on these Ozone ones, and you can actually increase everything altogether or decrease it altogether, which is great for dialing in the amount. So you could use this to dial in more specific settings for everything once you have the general sort of shape of the tone of your harmonic exciting. You could use that band mode to link everything together and then go through and adjust all the bands together to dial in the amount that you need. So that's some different mix bus processing ideas about how to use distortion to add color and harmonics to your tracks. You could even get really wild with this and add a tube distortion plugin to the entire mix and drive like an acoustic mix really hard so it sounds like it was overdriven through a tube processor of some kind. So there's really no limit to what you can do here. I'd recommend sort of erring on the side of a little bit more subtle because you're just trying to enhance the general color and tone of everything. You're not trying to radically change elements inside your mix. Because you could always go through and change individual tracks if you need to.